And I'm also going to try the AI companion. So we will see if that works, how that works. Um, so first of all, thank you for coming today. I'm going to share with you some thoughts and some thinking that I've been doing. I've been doing a deep dive on what nature's lessons on collaboration might be. I've was I've been thinking a lot about some of the challenges that we're facing as we move forward, and it seems to me that with climate change as a specific example, that we're going to need a lot of systems transformations to get to the other side of all of our defaults of how we've been showing up in the world and the degenerating world that we've created through our business models and our leadership and our social frameworks, and beginning to ask ourselves, how do we move forward and how do we start really working together to create a more regenerative future for us so we can create a better life for our great grandchildren and other folks that come after us. So that's the frame. And a friend of mine who's in Melbourne asked me to, she runs a Catalyst network out of Melbourne, Australia, working with folks from Australia and that kind of South Asia region of the world. And they've been thinking a lot about collaboration, what collaboration looks like and could look like. And so they asked me to do something in August, and I started doing a deep dive into the ocean ecology. So normally, I usually write about prairies and forests because that's something that's very familiar to where I live. But the ocean ecology, I haven't done a lot of studying. So I did a lot of that. And I've come up with this framework of what the ocean ecology could teach us about collaboration. So Daniel, if you can pop up the first slide, I will. Our framework for today is I'm going to kind of share some of the basic thinking patterns and lessons that nature. Can you do that, Daniel?
I'm working on it. Yep.
Okay. And then we'll just kind of open it up for all the interesting thoughts and connections that you might be making. Okay, you can advance the slide and maybe get it to fit.
Oh, is it not fitting in the screen?
Maybe that's just me and I can just...
Can everybody see the full slide?
Yes, it looks fine to me.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks.
I need to... okay, well, okay, we'll try this. So the first thing that we've discovered, so it's almost like there is a world underneath the surface of the planet in the ocean that is a parallel universe to the world that we know of in our world. And there are some things that are similar, but there are certain very core elemental differences in the design that we find in the ocean. So the first thing we discover is like ours, it's a very complex world, but unlike ours, where we tend to have a world built on tasks and relationships and actions and goals and strategies, nature actually is built on relationships. So their whole organizing structure is who's in relationship to who. And we often think of, the ocean as a deep, dark, cold place filled with predator and prey, and that's primarily the level of relationships that they have. But in actuality, it's formed on something quite different. It's an ancient system of give and take, and that is really what holds the dynamic balance in this ecology. It's a place where communities of life cooperate with each other, and where the diversity is dazzling and everybody has to play their part in order to maintain this delicate and dynamic balance. So some things that we as a kind of a human world are still struggling to figure out, how do we embrace things like diversity and incorporate cooperation as a primary framework, or value the importance of relationships under the ocean. These things are already sorted out, and that's how the ocean is structured. You can advance the slide, Daniel. So I thought that it might be helpful to understand, why is cooperation and collaboration an essential fit for today. So I talked before about, well, we're going to need to collaborate to transform many, many different systems to start building towards a regenerative future. But we also have a history of collaboration and what triggered why collaboration matters. So, and this is really anchored to the rise of the knowledge economy. So the knowledge economy and knowledge workers, as in its current iteration is probably AI and data, among other things, came in the 80s, mid 80s or so. And it was significant in the sense that it was the first time in our human history that a resource was infinite rather than finite. So before that, land, resources, money were finite frameworks that built businesses and built enterprise. But the knowledge economy actually requires cooperation in order for it to be economically efficient. In other words, knowledge that is held and privatized doesn't grow, it doesn't regenerate, or it isn't generative, and it doesn't evolve. And so knowledge expands when it's shared, not when it's held or privatized. So it paces the deep and models the deep interdependence of nature, that things in relationship to each other are amplified in strange and sometimes mysterious ways, and sometimes invisible ways. You can go forward, Daniel. So this is kind of the logic of the knowledge economy. So we start in this upper right-hand quadrant of knowledge is collected through technology. Knowledge flows through technology, but resides with people. And then it moves from individual intelligence to a collection of individual intelligences. But what really makes it significant for an organization or society is the development towards a collective intelligence, which is accomplished through collaboration and conversation with each other. So then this collective intelligence is reinvested into the next business cycle, and it accelerates the adaptation of innovation and evolution of the organization. So this is kind of the cycle, round and round in a circle. And the organization, or the society or the community that can develop these collective intelligences and reinvest it into their next evolution as a community or an organization, they basically win the day in terms of developing a valuable niche in relationship to the world. Okay, you can go next, Daniel. So if we were going to ask the question, what would an organizational culture look like that banked on diversity and rewarded cooperation? So basically, there are a number of nature design principles, and two of them is that nature rewards collaboration and it banks on diversity. So the more diverse an ecology is, the greater the collaborative energy in that system. And it generates over time, through mutual relationships, a more generous system. So basically what happens is, in type 3 forests, old growth forests, in the ocean ecology and mature prairies, what happens is that the more diversity you have in the system, the more resilient the system becomes, and the more regenerative the system becomes. And because different species are connecting and being in relationship to each other, they form the possibility of mutualistic exchange or reciprocal exchanges of resources. So instead of drawing from the earth for all of its nutrients, they start exchanging their nutrients with each other. And when that happens, one of the beautiful things is that the system doesn't need as many resources from the soil because they're generating it through the diversity of their relationships. And that in turn starts shaping the quality and culture of the system, which becomes more and more generous the more diverse they become. And nature is one of the ways that it rewards cooperation is through a fundamental framework of photosynthesis. So the sunlight shares energy, but it requires the active cooperation of leaves and grass and algae to transform that energy into nutrients that fuel all life. And one of the things I discovered in studying the ocean ecology is that this capacity to be drawn to each other is actually anchored in biochemistry. So it's anchored in our neurotransmitters and our hormones, pheromones that pull us together as opposed to pull us apart. And this understanding, this kind of deep anchoring in the neurotransmitters and pheromones and hormones actually can be traced back to the first understanding of bacteria. So long time it's been with us. And then interdependence of nature makes cooperation and collaboration the soul of all life. And that's actually what is the real mystery in the ocean ecology, is that this is what's holding us together. Next slide. So this beautiful spiral is the spiral of evolution. And it kind of shows how nature would, if we asked nature how to create profit or how to define profit, it would look at this kind of sequence of evolution. And evolution always starts, if you think of this at the center of the shell over here, starts with some kind of forcing feedback that gets the system to adjust or rethink itself. And then that feedback, because nature evolves with information and feedback, that feedback then drives the next stage, which is how is the system and the individual species within that system going to adapt? And often that builds greater complexity, evolutionary kind of complexity. And that shifts us to certain kinds of specializations, and then specializations increase the diversification and diversity of the system, which then adds to another layer of complexity in the system. But when these first 5 things happen, there are also other things that happen in how we connect and relate to each other. One is there's a greater kind of predisposition for interdependence. And so the system tips towards not individual self-interest. That would be a human term, of course, but in nature, it would be tipping towards a deep interdependence and understanding how we are connected to each other. And that connection is actually seen through the lens of relationship, which then predisposes the system to cooperate. This is how nature rewards cooperation. And then another emergence happens of a new culture with a certain amount of synergy. And then the whole system resets to a higher level of evolution. And this goes on over and over and over again. And we get back to forcing feedback, and that takes the journey again. So nature would always look at, are we evolving as its criteria for moving forward? Next slide, Daniel. So as I was noticing the way an ocean ecology sees relationships and juxtaposing that to what I see in organizations, these were some of the interesting tensions that got lifted up for me. First of all, we have a structure of hiring, paying, evaluating, and promoting people based on their individual actions and productivity. But in nature, relationships are the center of all life. So instead of promoting people individually, we might want to be, if we were following nature's model, we would be looking at how are we in relationship to each other? How is the space between us nurtured and designed and created to create synergy or evolution in our organizations. In our organizational systems, we really don't reward cooperation or collaboration. And many of our organizations that are still struggling with being siloed would be an example of that. In nature, collaboration is actively rewarded. So the species that is isolated tends to die off completely. So that's one example of not being rewarded for their behavior. Collaboration is assigned in our human systems, but it occurs naturally and by choice in natural systems. It's episodic in our human organizations, often driven by problems, like you two divisions have to work together to solve X, Y, or Z, or these organizations come together to collaborate in a way to solve a specific problem. But in nature, collaboration is long-term and it lasts a lifetime. So there's nothing episodic about it. Power in human systems have infected our view of relationships. Hierarchical, rank ordering, zero-sum power frameworks, scarcity, self-interest, those are all kind of lenses of power and how they play out in our relationships. But in nature, there's a mutuality and reciprocal respect that shapes our relationships, not power. And this is a very important thing to pay attention to. It's like, because I don't think growing up in a system where power has infected most of the relationships that we see, that it is natural to see another way without maybe looking to nature to understand it. Next slide, Daniel. Taking time to build relationships is seen as a waste of time. I've talked to a number of colleagues who have been actively working in communities or across organizations. And one of the things that they struggle with is that often they see a value in building trust and commitment before they engage in the collaboration, but they have other partners in the collaboration who actually don't they think it's a waste of time. They want to get right to the task. And that's part of the tension, I think, that we're experiencing today. But in nature and in the ocean, animals take time to choose each other. It's a slow courtship that builds commitment and trust. And as I said before, it lasts a lifetime. So it might be 10 years, 50 years, hundreds of years, even thousands of years in some cases. Collaborative projects in our human framework are framed as goals to be accomplished. But in the ocean, it's more a way of life. So it's designed to support a higher shared purpose and create conditions conducive to the future generations. So something that touches every living entity on the planet. So it's a very deeply different way of seeing the world. And because there's a very different kind of worldview, there are different actions and assumptions and processes and behaviors that flow from that. So go to the next. So when I said that power has kind of been embedded in our relationships and our view of relationships, and this is kind of driven in part by our sense of self-interest, as opposed to our enlightened self-interest or our how do we see ourselves in relationships. So this picture of the wolf in Yellowstone is an example of how nature might see relationships and power differently. So wolves are a keystone species in a forest ecology. And one of the benefits and outcomes of having keystone species in an ecology is that where their presence provides a feedback loop that curbs excess within that ecology. And as a result, their presence isn't about them eating more and other species in that ecology being at risk. Their presence actually shapes the behavior of the system. So the system becomes more regenerative, more resilient, and it actually supports greater diversity in the ecological system. So this is a very different framework, usually keystone species, a human term placed on the role that these animals have in our environment are seen as, from a human lens, oh, they're the apex predator of the system. But nature doesn't see their role as being all powerful. They see it more in a reciprocal and creation of balance and equity, so that the system, this ancient system of give and take, works. I read somewhere that cougars, when they take down a caribou or an elk or something like that, they bury what they can't eat. And there's all kinds of other species that feed off that carcass, not just the cougar coming back. It's not just that who's ever takes it down gets all the spoils. It's also shared by all kinds of other species in the environment. But we use things like depend on yourself as a kind of a story ancestral rule, for how we work. And the assumption is that if we depend on others through a collaborative enterprise, this would somehow or other be a problem. It would make you weaker as opposed to stronger if you depended on others. Needing others is a sign of weakness. Who has the power in the collaboration project? I suspect many of you have been in collaborative enterprises or organizations where you go in with an assumption of collaboration, but you get surprised by other people maybe showing up with a power lens, and then who counts, who doesn't count, whose voice is listened to, whose voice is not listened to, who's dismissed and whose ideas are taken. A lot of that is the infusion of power somehow, infection of power, I guess that would be a better way of saying that. So, a lot of our DEI work, and our who should be at the table, who shouldn't be at the table, those things are framed from this power lens of marginalized populations are often ones that are not perceived as having power, and therefore they don't need or shouldn't be included. To be included, one must have power. When we infect power into our relationships, power becomes the price of admission. So with all of these kinds of infections, it's no wonder that collaboration across organizations or humans in organizations or communities can be challenging. This is just a way of helping us see the juxtaposition, but also it helps us see the powerful lessons that, in this case, an ocean ecology could share with us. Next slide, Daniel. So, this whole framework of what is the alternative to power, was really surprising to me, and I felt it was deeply significant. So this is an example of I think it's a great white shark. It might be another kind of shark, but they build these reciprocal relationships with the sardines, because the sardines travel along with them, but the shark isn't eating the sardines. The sardines are cleaning the shark. That's one of their reciprocal relationships. But if we look at this visual from a power lens, we think the shark's in control and the sardines are at risk. But in nature, it would look at this and they'd say, oh, this is a reciprocal relationship. It's not the size of the fish that makes them more powerful. It's that each of them have something that the other wants or needs, and they create these understandings and relationships to live a better quality of life. So instead of power, in nature, they're based in mutuality. What do you have in abundance that I need, and what do I have in abundance that you need? That's the mutualistic exchange. And so we would be, if we were going to bring this to a collaboration, we might be asking, what does each partner have in the collaboration have to offer us? We would be taking some time to unpack that so we could see the mutuality in our relationships as opposed to perhaps the power as the primary lens. What do others need that I can provide, and vice versa? And how do I respect others regardless of size? So I don't see size or the size of the budget or the size of the positional power as the fundamental evaluation of who's in charge in the system. So cleaning stations across the ocean, there are cleaning stations. And I've often wondered about this, that when we evolved to two arms and opposable thumbs, we could walk into a shower and clean ourselves. But the way fish are structured, they really can't clean themselves because they have fins, but they can't reach their whole body, right? So what happens is that there are literally places on a lot of the coral reefs, but also often in the middle of the ocean, where fish who have accumulated algae and other kinds of things, they actually swim up to them. They change their color, maybe from a silvery green to a deep blue or purple, and then they slide back into this space. And then all these little fish that look kind of like spiders almost come out and they start cleaning and eating. For them, it would be a feeding station, of course. They start cleaning the bacteria and algae and other things. They even go into a shark's mouth or a tuna's mouth and clean the whole mouth as well. So again, our lens is it's a cleaning station, but for all the species, these small species that clean, they're getting food from it. It's a mutualistic exchange. It's a reciprocal process. And oftentimes the fish apparently like to go there just because it feels good too. So it's not just only necessity. Again, it kind of gives this framework of an ecology built on companionship and friendships and relationships. Okay, next one. So then how does another, this is another lens on what would power look like in an ocean ecology. Well, it doesn't look like a fight to the end or a fight to the death. It actually, this is an example of rockfish. And when they have territorial disputes, they kind of go nose to nose. And they have this dance. They push back and forth across the boundary line. No rockfish are killed as a result of this activity. It's just a ritualistic kind of dance to define the boundary in the system. Think about what that would look like in our world today. So neither fish gets hurt in the dispute, but there is a dance that says you're in my territory. Next one, Daniel. So I've been thinking a lot about, how do we have less suffering in our lives? And of course, the Buddhist philosophy here, I think, is kind of intriguing to me, which is we create our own suffering by denying our interdependence. So that's my kind of statement, bold statement. And one of the ways we create suffering in a Buddhist framework is by holding on too tightly to a worldview that doesn't actually fit the reality of what's going on. And so if the world is fundamentally designed in relationships and interdependence, but we view the world as separate kind of survival of the fittest, which isn't a good representation of Darwin's work. His work was survival of the best fit, but it was co-opted and turned into survival of the fittest, which framed our world as a scary place. And the way we survive and the people we care about survive is to have the most power, the most money, the most might, so we can win a fight. But this holding on too tightly and then running away, denying that we're in relationship naturally to each other, are two ways that we start engaging in behavior that doesn't actually pace the reality of the living world around us. And so as a result, we get into problems, and that creates our suffering. So when we maintain separation and isolation in an interdependent world, we create more suffering in collaboration as well. So how do we become conscious of our frameworks and what's kind of increasing our suffering? And is there another way? Okay, next slide, Daniel. So these are, this comes from a different source, but also intriguing because this comes out of the HP inkjet division in Oregon. And they were talking about what do different networks look like when they're designed to collaborate, when they're designed to make decisions like the hierarchical social network, or when they're designed to disseminate ideas. So in the collaborative social network, which is best as a social network for innovation and generative new knowledge, it looks like mutuality. Everybody has equal kind of reciprocal connection to each other, and there is kind of a synergy that emerges from that reciprocity and equitable relationships. So it's a mutuality, reciprocal design that looks just like the ocean ecology. And they have found that in their research that when you inject a person who's trying to make a decision from the high, maybe a person that's higher up in the hierarchy, into this innovative network, it basically stops the innovation in its tracks. So the quality of your relationships based on what you're hoping to get out of it, if it's innovation, it requires this more nature framework on relationships than traditional human organizations, hierarchical or otherwise. The hierarchical social network is something that we're fairly familiar with, that eventually an innovation might surface, but somebody in charge has to say, yeah, we're going to do that and go that direction. And so that looks much more hierarchical in its design. And we're familiar with that dynamic. The distributive network is interesting because it also is more network as opposed to hierarchy. So it's more horizontal than vertical. But that there are certain people, maybe some who have been part of the collaborative social network, that have lots of additional connections and networks that they're connected to. And you put them as kind of nodes that then spread outward and share collaboration or a new idea. And that's kind of how innovation gets disseminated. You can see this actually in the AI movement, is that there are certain people who are helping to disseminate that innovation into our social zeitgeist, so to speak. Okay, go next. So then, no, there we go. So these same folks out of Hewlett Packard, I first ran into this whole paper based on at a systems learning organization conference that happened in the late 90s. But they were so the engineers were all looking at these kind of supporting and dampening down feedback loops. And so you can kind of see this collaborative process through their eyes. Is you might start with collaboration that reinforces listening and observing to each other and seeking understanding with each other, which then builds trust, which creates this positive beneficial loop on collaboration. But then collaboration in turn also supports creativity, innovation, and drives excitement and appreciation and increased participation, which then reinforces the collaboration that drives the creative innovation framework. But most of us are more familiar with this kind of separation that decreases trust and listening and observing, which leads to more misunderstanding and diminishes trust in the system. So we have that dynamic going, which then in turn reduces the creativity that is based on more generative collaboration and reciprocal exchange, increases frustration, blame, and fear. So you get a lot of finger pointing, and increases self-interest and internal competition, which reinforces separation. And then when you have reduced creativity and support, increases our organizational costs and decreases our resources, which then drive additional internal competition. So this kind of frame is just how they were mapping what was happening in their system. And also because they needed innovation to continue to be relevant in their world, they were trying to intentionally build these collaborative processes and collaborative systems and feedback loops in the behavior and the system in their organization. So you can go next, Daniel. So in the late 90s, I was part of a Kellogg leadership studies project that went on for 5 years and brought together all the major writers on leadership at that time, primarily from the US. And James McGregor Burns was kind of the lead scholar on it. And over time, there were 5 women who got together and wrote a paper as part of this project called Leadership in the 21st Century. And in it, we were trying to collect what is the deeper wisdom from these 5 years of conversation with people. There was a few practitioners in the room, but not that many. So, but when we were writing the leadership in the 21st century, we thought that it would be requiring these kinds of leadership processes. So we were this paper really is on what collaborative leadership could look like. And it promotes a collective leadership project. It structures a learning environment. It supports relationships and interconnectedness. It fosters shared power, old language from nature's point of view, but appropriate for human consumption, practicing stewardship and service, and evaluating diversity, inclusion, and committing to our self-development. So these are the things that we thought were essential for this kind of collaborative, collective framework for leadership. Keep going. One more slide. So as a result of that, we met at Solia Sombra, which was high in the mountains outside of Santa Fe. It was Georgia O'Keeffe's old estate that belonged to some creative folks out of Houston who had bought it. And it was a place where they were inviting people who wanted to think interesting and different thoughts to come together, and they would provide room and board. And as long as we got there, they would support our creative process. And so that was the place that was designed on a permaculture framework of design to be inspired. And so as a result, we started asking the question, towards what end should leadership be moving? And we came up with these 3 thoughts, to create a supportive environment where people can thrive and grow and live in peace with one another. And then underneath that, we thought to get there, we needed to strengthen our collective leadership practices. And then we have a series of kind of defined ways and practices that help us do it. The second part of that purpose of leadership was to promote harmony with nature, and therefore provide sustainability for future generations. If you could go to the next one, Daniel. And the third comment was to create a community of reciprocal care and shared responsibility, where every person matters and each person's welfare and dignity is a concern for us all. And so we created a series of cascading kind of detail under each of these. But if you see this visual on the left, there's within that fan coral is a seahorse. And these seahorses actually have been companions with the fan coral for many, many years, centuries. And they start looking like the fan coral. And so it creates a great kind of sense of camouflage for them. And but it's an example of reciprocal care, I thought. Okay, next slide. So let's go back. This kind of goes back to our first slide. So again, what if we saw the world like nature does? What does it help us see? What does it inform us to think about, and maybe in a slightly different way? a complex world built on relationships, an ancient system of give and take, communities of life cooperating. Diversity is dazzling, and everyone has to play their part to maintain the delicate and dynamic balance of the system. So I'd leave with you, and then we'll shift now to conversation, questions, insights, contributions, and places your mind went. So you can close this slide deck out, Daniel. So thoughts, questions, feel free to just unmute and talk or put your question in chat.
Kathleen, I apologize for not being on screen right at this moment, but I wanted to thank you for a very insightful and cohesive talk. I was inspired to think about how this may actually be relevant in corporate America today. And the cynical side of me, which pops out from time to time, was that in our economic hardship, everybody's go, go, go. Companies, I think, are really struggling to see the value in taking a pause to create long-lasting teams built on this fundamental trust. And it has been my experience as a person in the workforce that I think by nature, I would like to be a collaborative person, but at times when the teams are unequal in the commitment to collaboration or who gets the credit or who will be recognized, that's often a very large disincentive for people to work together because the collaborators are, rocking it out and they're doing their thing. And then when the day for the promotion comes, it's still not them because one person needs to be recognized as the champion who pulled this all together when it's truly those in the room who have the opportunity to be in a collaborative and group-minded mindset that made the process happen. So I will just rest that there, but I was very compelled by all the things you brought to us from the natural world, which mimic the best and worst, or the humans sort of echo the worst of the outcomes there. And with that, I will pause.
Yeah, thank you. And I think notice what goes unseen when you have to have one person have credit for the magic that happens in really good collaboration. All of the other roles that are essential to a great collaboration are now deemed invisible and not seen, not recognized, not rewarded. Unlike nature, it's very clear about how it does reward recognition and around collaboration. So I think the other thought I have that's associated with this is that a lot of my clients that feel like there's too much work flowing at them and not enough time to get it done, it's actually an organizational culture that hinders any kind of reflection or deep reflection or pause. And so as we create and promote those organizational cultures that it's just like work, 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 nobody has any time, there's a scarcity mentality around time. And then what happens is you begin to have a tunnel view about not having enough time. You don't have the bandwidth anymore to see the system. And what we're doing is we're basically trading activity for long-term impact. And we're going to have to face that tendency in our organizations if we want to create something different. Simon, you got your hand up.
Thank you. Yeah, and just to echo, it was a really insightful presentation, and there was so much in what Jennifer you commented and asked, and your response there, Kathy. I can't help but feel there's a real difference. First, there's a real difference between the sort of the outcome measures. So there seems to be in the human systems, there's a real outcome measure on a particular goal and something that's very short term and focused that way, whereas in natural systems, it's more around the evolution of the system itself and the knowledge sharing and the quality of the relationships and the interactions and the sort of the performance measures are so different if we were to put our human lens on the performance measures of a natural system versus our sort of conventional modern day cultural human systems in organizations in particular. So that was just my very stark kind of observation and what was just said. And I suppose my question and curiosity is, how do we change this, right? So what is it that I can't help feel you mentioned something about the story of the human separation, individualism, separation from one another, separation from nature, not seeing ourselves as part of this system, and that we ourselves are one of many, many nodes and have a unique participation to participate in the system, and not necessarily to be forceful in transforming the system, because the system evolves through our participation, even how it is right now, right or wrong. But what is it that we need to do as humans to kind of reframe our role in the system, to allow the system to evolve, to kind of heal something of this sort of separation from one another and nature?
I love the question, and I think sometimes having really good questions that we can sit with over time, because there's not an easy answer to them, actually is a great way of attracting our attention to something that is deep and meaningful and important. I do have a few thoughts, though, on that question. One is that when people experience something different, they fundamentally start changing, even if they might not have the majority of the culture surrounding them. So when you have an experience of a great team working together, it's something that speaks to our soul in an organization that over time can be transformative. So one simple thing we could do is we can model and we can articulate why what's happening is happening and why it's working. And when we do that, I think we create possibilities that we may or may not fully see, but do have an impact on us over time. But I love the question to sit with, because I think that is a deep, deep question that we need to answer for our future. Christine and then Sonia.
I love the language that Simon used of separation. Well, maybe Kathleen mentioned it first, but the separation, and I don't remember the context, the separation, or how it was brought up. Can you reiterate that again?
Simon, is that you asking Simon?
Well, I think he was referencing you, but
this goes back to one of Daniel's and my conversations quite a while ago, pre-pandemic. We were kind of talking about what's the shift in worldview that is kind of holding us back, that needs to happen and is holding us back from moving more deeply into sustainable and regenerative design. And one of the frameworks was this sense of mechanistic versus living system. Another was this kind of autonomy, separate framework versus connection and interdependence. And we had a few others, but when I look at the dynamics of the world at a 50,000-foot level, we're in a huge kind of battle with our worldviews. Is it a one planet worldview? Is it a worldview of deep connection, predisposition to connect, or is it a view of separation and therefore I have to defend and fight for everything I get?
Well, that separation and defense, and this idea of his question of my role in the system. And then I was thinking about AI is just sort of making this worse as we're grappling with this issue. And one of the things that was coming to mind, kind of as you were going through your progression of ideas, was that kind of two ideas that were persistent with me of when something isn't working, and it's not working, like what's going on isn't working, and it's generally because we're not doing what we say we're doing, and that means that we're not doing what we're trained to do, and we're not admitting that. We don't admit that to ourselves or the other, and then we end up going through these performative motions, and it becomes sort of a like we're doing too, and we're just sort of getting avoidant and defensive. And then what we're trained to do is insufficient for the moment, and that's an actually more threatening possibility, because we're going to cling to that until we die. And
It is scary.
and that's that sort of Buddhist thing we're creating our own suffering, right? And that feels, both of those are sort of, they feel negative, but they're both very human. And I see these examples everywhere. I saw them at the conference. I see them I saw them sort of as you were talking. I kind of saw them. And the where we put ourselves. So I was at this. The other thing was kind of have a thousand firecrackers as you were talking. I went to this lecture last night. I highly recommend this book for everyone. It's called Taming of Silicon Valley. He's sort of an antithesis to Ethan Mollick. And Ethan Mollick is kind of giving me a little bit of pause because everyone's following him. And he's misinterpreted a couple studies, and he's the great calling. And I'm not a joiner. And so the Taming of Silicon Valley, this guy is, he is basically, to Simon's question, what should we do? He's giving a really good prescriptive, very difficult message of it's time to belly up to the bar. It's time to really take ownership and responsibility and boycott and maybe not use some services or rise up or put some voice to it's time for the consumer to say enough. It's time to draw a line. It's time for these companies to have some oversight. He's sort of in the Amy Webb, the big nine category of like, it's time to, it's time to draw a line. So I think everyone in this group would appreciate that.
That's great. Thank you. The taming of Silicon Valley. And I think the behind what Christine is saying, it also requires us to start, if we're on a journey of consciousness, if we're beginning one, if we're deep into it, we got to show up and start deepening our own work. I
That's
think
basically what he was talking about.
Sonia, do you want to? You had your hand up.
I mean, that's kind of a perfect segment, Kathy. I mean, first of all, thank you for your talk, right? Kathy and I, for everybody else on the screen, everybody seems to have known Kathy for a long time. So you've been around for a long time, but I have the pleasure of knowing Kathy since 2012 when I moved to Minnesota, and have in fact been on a journey of deepening my understanding and connection of and with nature as part of my trajectory. And I'll just put it out there, and this is actually not relevant to what we're saying right here, but for anybody who hasn't participated in what happens when you ingest our friends who run the mycelium network underneath us, I would advocate for that as a way of feeling your connection to nature and never being able to forget it and use it as a force in your work. So that's one thought. The second thought is, if there's anything that gives people like us, and I'll speak for myself, if there's anything that can give me like a sense of anxiety about the world, it's that because I am who I am, and I adhere to Buddhist philosophy as well, that somehow that I can help change the world, like in a really big way, right? That's something that really gives me like, oh my God, really? And then when I look at nature and I look at the 11 acres where I live, and I understand that a couple of 100 feet from here, there's a little refugium in my backyard that is designed to survive incredible, incredible change around it. And it has, because all around it was an old gravel pit, and now we live here. And there's a refugium in there with the organisms and the trees and the moss and the grasses that was left by itself, and it's thriving. And so I think of that as a metaphor for this group and what are we going to do? And the question of what if we just did it as much as we could? Like, I'm somebody who has stopped working in organizations because they freaking ate me alive.
Mm.
And I now work with women, and I work with rural women one-on-one. And I host conversations, and I'm thinking about hosting ceremonies to make sure that the individuals like us who do the thinking and tending to the system, we ourselves are well. And so the question of what will this group do? I love the question. I'd love to be part of it. And I also need us to remember that we must not be co-opted by, if it's not big enough, it's not good enough, right? That in fact, this is maybe a refugium that preserves thought about leadership in a beautiful and special way for people to pick it up whenever they're ready. I
Oh,
don't know. So it's
I love
just,
that, Sonia.
this is not a question, but maybe a musing or something that can help us to think about what's next in 2025.
Beautiful. That's a great thing. There's an African proverb that that says something like, if you've ever wondered if you're too small to make a difference, you haven't spent a night in an enclosed space with a mosquito.
Right.
So, but yeah, I love where you've left us here, Sonia. It's you know, how do we? It goes back to how do we nourish ourselves to do the work. The thing that helps me in this work is the recognition that the system fundamentally that's around us is all interdependent, which means that the whole system is moving and designed to support connection and interdependence. And if we lose sight of that because our news feed or the modeling of organizations or individuals in our communities or in our political processes or everything else models this separation, we're also losing sight of a larger system dynamic that's leaning the system in the direction of connection, because everything around us is structured that way. It's just our conscious denial and refusal to see it that's actually hindering. So the real question to me as a system thinker is, how much pain do we have to suffer before we acknowledge the connection? And those of us who can see that tension and dynamic, we can help be purveyors like that dissemination network visual from Hewlett Packard to share and help articulate and help the people who are resisting that to maybe drop their lens of denial and engaged and maybe lean into it. So it's a process. But I learned this from Christine actually in the airport as we were flying back from the International Leadership Association conference, of this idea of radical inclusion, which means one of the ways we can burst the bubbles that people live in is by actually being in relationship to people who think very differently than ourselves and listen deeply to try to understand. And once that relationship happens, you also have a way of sharing information that they might not normally get. And then they will have to sit back and explain why they think the way they think, and maybe listen to themselves and maybe ask deeper questions. And then maybe that's how we move. Or interdependent systems change differently. They change more like a tipping point than they change as a power dynamic or policy dynamic. So the more people we can create having company with in our work going forward, the more we reach a critical mass in an interdependent system to shift the system, literally tip the system. So we are out of time, but thank you so much for joining us today. We will come back in January and be prepared for a conversation about what do we want to do from here with this network. And it's I'm grateful for all of you who have been with Daniel and I and Marianne and others on this journey together. So I look forward to our conversation in January 21st, same time.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Very much. Thank you, Kathleen.
You're very welcome.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks all.
Great. Okay, Daniel or Dale, so great to see you. You're unmuted.
Can you, okay, am I there now?
Yep.
I just want to say thank you very much. This is really great stuff today.
Oh,
And
good.
I looked at my calendar and the 21st, I've got a doctor's appointment scheduled at the exact
Oh.
same time as
Of course.
the, I might have to change my doctor's appointment.
Okay. Well,
But I just wanted to say, I have tried to attend most all these, and man,
Yeah.
this is really valuable stuff,
good.
especially the stuff today and the last time. I'm just trying to figure out how to spread this amongst the deeper thinkers in my community, because I think it helps them get through some of the frustrations they feel when they have these community conversations and trying to move the needle. And as you know, in McCook, we've got some ambitious people that are trying to do big things, and
yeah, we
boy,
do.
the successes we've had fit right into the points that you made today with collaboration and cooperation, and the abject failures we have had fit right into the self-interest and the
How interesting.
knowledge economy, you know, the struggle of the self-interested people to maintain the power. And you know, the thing that struck me is, you know, our president-elect, when he slipped and said in his first campaign that I love the uneducated.
Yeah.
Remember that.
Wow.
And, you know, it's just powerful stuff.
Powerful stuff.
So how, you know, there was some comments today made, how do we make a difference?
Yeah.
And one way is to maintain control of the education. I mean, in a sense that we can spread it rather than hold it close and only share it with those that we think are deserving of having it shared with us. So anyway, I don't want to keep you. I actually have to get to a doctor's appointment right now, and these are all just checkup type things. There's nothing going on like there is in the life of the person you, Marianne, is that who it was?
Yeah, Marianne.
Early on, you know, we know people that are facing, well, I'm at the age now where we all know people that are facing those kind of
we do
health challenges. So
you know, this will be recorded. You can look it up on my website. And
okay.
So, if you want to use it in any way with those deep thinkers as a provocative starting place,
Yeah,
feel free.
And even in our McCook Community Fund, we need to take some time to sit down and just be take a deeper dive into some of this stuff. But it can't take a long time. You just have to dip into it and get little snippets of it and pique their curiosity, and maybe we can have conversation later on about.
That's what I loved about our woman from last time, Sukiya, but I didn't get her name right. But I love this idea that she says you nudge the system to see what the dynamics are.
Yeah.
And anyway, always great to see you, Dale.
Some of the deeper discussions we've had to have about how we impact community just in McCook revolve around some of these core principles that were presented today. And if I can get people to reflect on them, I think it helps them in their decision-making process of what way we direct our payout to make impact in McCook. So anyway, thanks, Kathy. It's good seeing you again, and we'll keep in touch.
Okay. Have great holidays.
Thank you. Same.